G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. Here's a dangerous question for you. If you're a female, is the reason why you didn't want to be a truck driver because you are female? And if you're a male, is the reason why you don't want to be a kindergarten teacher because you're male? Do males and females differ in biological ways, in deeper ways than culture, in the things that they're interested in? This has become a somewhat fashionable idea. It explains certain strands of the new media ecosystem, from Jordan Peterson to potentially even Andrew Tate, but certainly to the manosphere of the Joe Rogans of the world. And it's a questionable intuition, like where the biology and the culture meet in an explanation of why the gender roles are split the way they are between housework and looking after babies and being CEOs and being abalone fishermen. I wanted to talk to somebody who actually spends her life studying the science of this stuff, the biological differences, what we understand about our intuitions about workplace inequalities, and whether or not there is such a thing as the patriarchy that is still assisting in organizing our social structures and our workplace arrangements and our households in a way that is deleterious to women's interests. Professor Cordelia Fine certainly thinks so. So she and I have a really constructive chat about exactly that. She's one of the most notable Australian academics in this field. Well, I say Australian. She was raised in Edinburgh and born in Canada. But we'll have her. We'll have her. We like doing that. She studied psychology at Oxford University. She got her master's in philosophy from Cambridge University. You might have heard of them, Oxford and Cambridge. She got a PhD in psychology from University College London. Never heard of that dump. And she has fascinating ideas about whether or not differences in men's and women's jobs and housework and play and childcare and incarceration levels and opportunities are caused by intrinsic genetic differences or social constructs, and whether or not, in the long run, that question even matters. She was recently named a living legend of research by the Australian newspaper. She is the author of Testosterone Rex, Delusions of Gender, and her latest book is Patriarchy, Inc. I hope you enjoy as much as I do this debate about biology and culture and sexism and masculinity and transgenderism and the patriarchy with the one, the only, Professor Cordelia Fine.
Even while we've got the Elon Musks and the Donald Trumps, we also have what seems to be a concerted effort to try and open up masculinity to more traditionally feminine roles. There's pushes to increase parental leave, for example, or paternity leave specifically. Some men are asking for more flexible work. They want to be more involved in their children's lives. The survey data are saying that they would rather, if they could, even if it meant they were earning less money, they would actually rather be able to spend more time with their family. Then there's this sort of small group of people who are small but growing and, not to be ignored, saying, if you take care of children or at home, that you're less of a man. So we have these sort of, maybe it's that we have very contradictory concepts of masculinity taking place at the moment. We've got the effects of the feminist movement that have brought women very much into the public sphere to a degree that is unprecedented since the Industrial Revolution. We've got this sort of fairly fledgling movement to bring men back home. They were pushed out during industrialization. Now they're some of them at least are knocking on the door, and women are embracing that. And I guess we're having to reestablish gender roles in some ways. Who does what, whose responsibility is what, how should we be, and that's always uncomfortable.
Is that desire, that push, the former push that you articulated for men to have things like paternity leave and, paid paternity leave, do more stuff at the home, is that a net positive for women?
I think so. I mean, this is something that feminists have been thinking about for decades. Gender roles have been crumbling for quite a long time. The traditional heterosexual household never was perfect for all households, of course, and it's become less and less of the norm. And if you think about, the societies that we're in, most of the most of the goods that we get in terms of income, wealth, status, the opportunity to engage in, meaningful social contributions, a lot of the goods of society do come from participation in the paid market and the labor market. At the same time, that, of course, that work of raising the next generation and caring for people, that's an essential part of the economy too. But so long as that work, that really essential work in our current political economy is sort of mostly delegated to one sex rather than the other, it's really hard to see how you can get genuine equality. So to the extent that you have men doing more of that unpaid work, kind of, just mixing things up a bit more, breaking down that old separation between the breadwinner and the homemaker. A lot of feminists have argued, look, we've done the sums, we've calculated that actually this is the only way that we can get to something that we can call gender equality. If we're all working 60-hour weeks in this precarious economy, that's not going to work for obvious reasons. If we just delegate it mostly to women, they're gonna be economically marginalized, socially marginalized, politically marginalized. Let's try and create an economy and workplaces where we recognize that people don't have, your workers don't have a wife at home taking care of things, and build that into our policies, into our norms, into the very way that we do work. And I think that has been happening, but it's a really slow process, obviously.
Let me just interrogate a few of the things that you've articulated there. The first notable one being that the homemaker is the person who is socially and politically marginalized, not just economically marginalized, right? Let's grant that they're economically marginalized insofar as the traditional deal was you only get compensated insofar as you don't have to work, right? You don't get additional compensation on top of the fact that you get fed and housed, and we split our income, but you don't have to work. Outside of the home. I've found, and I have a slightly unusual situation in that we're both males in my relationship, but I've found that most of that after the first few years of having babies, once the kids started going to preschool and school, the vast bulk of our social and creative fulfillment has come from extracurricular, from non-work related sides of things. And if I had to choose which is the more emotionally flourishing and satisfying and fulfilling part of my life, it would probably be having beers and fish and chips at the bowling club on Friday afternoon with my kids' friends' parents, rather than hunkering away trying to figure out how to make a podcast profitable. What's the retort to that?
Yeah. So no disagreement from here. I mean, this is not at all. I think feminists are sometimes seen as denigrating, that work of caring for family, and that's not the case at all. There's, that work that we do caring for our children, caring for our family, that is some of the most meaningful. One doesn't even want to call it work in a sense, obviously, that you can do. A lot of people do find a lot of joy and meaning and reward in that.
But the casting of it as work is part of the critique against feminism, isn't it? The sense that it somehow degrades the position to be like, well, it needs financial compensation, because I guess there seems to be an implicit assumption that there's no reason why anyone in their right minds would ever raise a child or be part of a community were they not paid by the government or somehow, paid financially to do so.
Maybe there's a strand of feminist thought that thinks that it's just a kind of form of work like any other. But I think the point is rather that, particularly once you have societies like our own, where you have, high divorce rates, you have, fairly low fertility, and you have long lives. When you have one group of people who are kind of, because they have devoted so much of their time and energy to that side of things, that they're kind of now have limited options in the other side of things, that's going to put them in a difficult position. And when I say that they're being kind of socially marginalized, I don't mean that they're doing something that is pointless or worthless. I mean, always the message of feminism has been that it's just sort of taken for granted. So we pay lip service to it being important, but that's sort of not necessarily reflected in other ways.
Right. Every politician gets up on the stump speech and says the hardest job in the world is being a mom, and they get the applause, and then they do nothing to make it easier.
Yeah. But people still have to live. We have single mothers who are suffering very high rates of poverty, and that's their children too. So we're, even though they're doing this incredibly important job, they're not necessarily getting as much support for it as they should. But if you think about, yes, there are important things that one can do in the community in terms of school or other kinds of church or whatever it might be. But a lot of what happens in society is happening at work. It's happening in workplaces. It's where the products are being created. It's where services are being created. And when you have majority men or any particular group that it might be in leadership, that's what I mean by being socially marginalized. So you've got a lot of decisions, a lot of important decisions being made, resources being allocated, innovations happening. And if it's one group of people are not really necessarily participating in that, that's the form of social marginalization. I would say the other aspect of it is that in our societies, it does tend to be through our work that we get our status. So to the extent that we still have men who are, dominating in positions of authority, and particularly in these industries like tech or finance that have become the most, the most powerful industries, that's where we get our status from, and it's kind of maintaining the position of women as lower status than men. So hopefully that
Yes. And so if you were trying to transition from a world in which women were essentially forcibly excluded from the workforce to one in which they had parity, not necessarily, you don't condone a 50-50 gender split in every single, you don't want women to be 50% of the offshore oil rig workforce if they don't want to be, right? But correct me if I'm wrong there. Is that right?
I don't want to force people. No, I don't want to force people into jobs in order to
there's going to be a natural division, right? So,
50.
so the ability to fulfill one's aspirations presumably has to be the goal rather than the achievement of perfect parity in every profession. Then, is that, yes, jump in?
Okay. Well, I suppose I would say that, so I think this comes to a really important point, because we have had this shift, right? So we had the last century where it was taken for granted that certain kinds of jobs were for men and certain kinds of jobs were for women. We then had the second wave feminist movement that, created sex discrimination laws and equal opportunity acts and so on. And it's easy to forget how recent that is. I mean, I think in Australia, the Federal Sex Discrimination Act was only passed in 1984 or something like that. So, it's fairly recent. And we've focused a lot on, various forms of discrimination in the workplace. And I think, a lot of people will say, yeah, look, we should definitely, if women are being discriminated against in male dominated organizations, we should, definitely get rid of that. But, we've done a lot of work. We made a lot of progress in that respect. And it's true. We really have, particularly in some areas, maybe less so in others. But at a certain point, we have to explain these disparities to a significant degree in terms of the preferences, the aspirations that people have. And of course, I agree. I'm not saying that we should be, saying, sorry, you've got to be a physicist, you can be a nurse. Sorry, it's just the numbers. Okay, I'm not.
Well, nurses and physicists would be okay. It's where you get to the male overrepresentation of garbage men and soldiers and miners that I wouldn't want to be sent down there if I was a woman or a man. But carry on.
Well, yeah. Well, look, I mean, I have to say there are some kind of blue collar occupations where women did actually, there are kind of dirty, dangerous jobs, and women were trying to join those because they were paying reasonably well or better than the options available to them. And there was a lot of, discrimination and harassment against women who wanted to join those jobs. But
what were those? What sorts of things?
So that would be kind of blue collar, the heavy industries and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Didn't that change during wartime when all of a sudden women had to work in factories in the 40s because there were no young men to man factories?
Yeah. So, but I'm actually talking about this I think it was like the 1980s that there were these big sex discrimination cases taking place. Yes. This was in the US. Yeah. Yeah, but I think one thing that we have to look at is also thinking about the fact that our preferences and our aspirations don't come to us fully formed. So that's one of the things that I want to talk about, that I talk about in the book, that we can focus a lot on the interactions that we have in organizations. And there's a lot of attention on that, for example, making sure that we try and eliminate sexual harassment or unconscious bias or gender biases or all these kinds of things. But we also have these preferences. So you're quite right. So people are making choices about what kind of occupations they want to pursue, what kind of trade-offs they want to make. And we don't want to kind of override people's preferences. But, there's a philosopher called David Benatar has a really nice way of putting it. He wrote quite a controversial book called The Second Sexism, which was actually about discrimination against men. And he was discussing affirmative action, and he's sort of generally against it for kind of various interesting reasons. But he has this really nice way of putting it. He says that it's hard to know what to do when you have these preferences that people hold. So they make choices and they identify with these choices. They're not feeling coerced in any kind of way. When I look at my university and I work in an arts faculty, nobody's sort of telling their kids, you have to, these young women, because it is female dominated, like, you have to do an arts degree. But sometimes you hear about parents saying, like, please do commerce. So people aren't being, very insulting. So people aren't being forced, in our societies into these roles, but there can still be these background influences in the preferences that people form. So, we're always developing our sense of self, and part of that self is our sense of ourselves as a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. And we know how, these identities, of course, there's lots of room for individuality, but these identities are layered with culturally shared meanings. We can't just make up for ourselves what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. We know how variable these understandings of what it means to be a man or a woman or a father or a mother are. They're changing across time. And we talked about masculinity is changing, and there are these sort of competing ideas of what it means to be a man at play. So, if we still have a situation where, the cultural meanings of what it means to be a man and a woman are still creating a situation in which we have, men have higher status and they have more power over all, various resources collectively as a group, then we can't just sort of say, okay, job's done. We have Sex Discrimination Act now. Everything's fine. What we do about that, because you say we don't want to start doing brainwashing or anything like that. What we do about it is really tricky, right? And this was Benatar's point. He was saying it just doesn't make sense to have affirmative action, because in a different society with different gender influences, more women would have wanted to be mathematicians or whatever it might be, right? But we can still recognize that these influences are shaping who we are and the preferences that we have, even when we identify with them.
Yeah, I mean, this is a perennial problem, isn't it? About not just in terms of sex roles and gender roles, but also in economics. And I mean, Marx talked about the false consciousness of the proletariat, and lots of progressives in the United States and Europe are tearing their hair out about why working class people are voting for aristocrats who are populists, who say the right things about social and cultural issues, but then actually screw them on economics. And it's hard to know when you think you can see someone making an incorrect choice, or a choice that is influenced by a whole bunch of assumptions that they've inherited from their culture. It's difficult to know at what point to try to disabuse them of that, and at what point to just say, well, if the stupid proletarian wants to vote for policies that just get him a cheaper flat screen television set, then maybe that is a desire, even if that desire is driven by a consumerist culture that in an ideal world we wouldn't live in.
Yeah, I think I'm saying probably something slightly different than that. I mean, I think I'm not saying that people are making errors in the preferences that they have, or that they're in some sense behaving irrationally. I think, people are developing their preferences in the world as it is, as opposed to the world as maybe some of us might wish that it were. And there's nothing necessarily very irrational about that. So I'm not saying that people are making errors. I'm just saying that people's preferences and their sense of themselves and the experiences that they have that become part of their understanding of what they might be good at and what they might enjoy. These are all shaped by.
Well, they might not be making an individual error, but I think you must be suggesting that they're making a collective error of some kind. Otherwise, it wouldn't need redressing.
A collective error.
You know what I mean? Like I'm using the analogy of the working class person who votes against their interest as a way of teasing out. That may be an example in which we ascribe greater culpability to the person for being a buffoon. But I think still implicit in your critique is the belief that there is something impure about the preferences that we claim to think are coming from a place of nowhere, that they're not coming from a place of nowhere, that we are in some cases being misled about whether or not a male is necessarily better suited to a STEM profession and a woman is necessarily better suited to nursing.
Okay. So I think there's a few things going on there. So first of all, I think there's a distinction between saying that there's something impure about the preferences that people have formed that, might go against what I would prefer them to prefer as a feminist. And the idea that the stories or the narrative or the explanations that we have as to why those preferences are made. So, not so long ago, when scientists actually were exploring gender development, they were looking at these gender roles, that the girl would grow up and be the housekeeper. And if she had a job, it would be a little job. And, she would care about her appearance and she'd be a good housekeeper, all this old fashioned stuff, right? And opposite for boys. And they took it for granted that these were these were social roles that children had to be socialized into. And then in the 70s and 80s, sort of two conflicting, changes were occurring in the scientific and political context. So first of all, there were more women joining, science as biologists and psychologists and so on. So there's the rise of women, and some of them were feminists, and they're saying, what do you mean that it's the natural, it's the rightful role of women to do this and men to do that? So they were challenging this idea that we should be socializing people into boys and girls into these gender roles. And then there was growing interest in the role of biological influences on sex role behavior. And so on the other side, people saying, well, it's not just about socialization. You also have to look at biological influences. And the two kind of got connected in the scientific literature. So they started to look at, investigate whether there are biological influences onto what previously had been understood as socially constructed roles. So I think what I'm saying here is there's a difference between saying, look, we say that these preferences are given to us by biology. That's a sort of explanation for the preferences that we have, but they're just sort of in there. They're now being freely expressed. And that's a scientific question. And that's a bit different to saying that there's something somehow wrong or impure or irrational about the preferences that people have. I mean, the way that, if you think about the gender system, in many ways, it's set up to reward gender conformity and to punish gender nonconformity. And so people are making their decisions, in that context.
Yes, of course. No, I mean, I'm not inviting you to blame people. I think just to clarify, the point that I'm trying to point to is a position that would say, to the extent that gender differences are biological, we are not responsible for them, and it's probably futile to fight them. And there is this kind of school of thought of in evolutionary biology, especially in the manosphere, right? This is a kind of a Jordan Peterson attitude, which says there are fundamental differences and we fight them at our peril. And if you gave everybody the it wouldn't matter what society or culture you were in or what era, if you gathered 1,000 males in a room and you gathered 1,000 females in a room and you gave them all the option of either taking apart a machine and putting the widgets back together again, or sitting around with a family that has, family issues and trying to resolve those issues, you would find a greater preponderance of the widget putter-togetherers in the male cohort and a greater preponderance of the therapists in the female cohort, and that there's something biological about that to do with a female aptitude for compassion and a male aptitude for widgets or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. There would be that. Then if you come along and say, hang on, that's bullshit because there is no blank slate universe in which we can test this hypothesis on people who haven't been acculturated in a sexist environment. And it may be the case that boys are taught to like widgets and girls are taught to have feelings and so on. In that latter case, I think, is where you start coming up against this challenge of sort of false consciousness, right? Like if it occurs to the boy that he gets happy when he gets the widget, and it occurs to the girl that she gets happy when she becomes a therapist, which women are massively overrepresented in, then don't we bump up against a challenge of what does it mean to say that those desires are illusory or contaminated?
I think I don't think the desires are illusory or contaminated. So I don't think people are going around in a state of false consciousness about the...
So is the problem simply that it then leads to an economy in which one group has more power?
Yeah, it's about... Okay. So,
like, you know what I mean? Yeah. Sorry. Basically, where's the problem? Like, the question is, where's the problem if you have a society in which, women are doing the things that women like doing and men are doing the things that men like doing?
Oh, right. Okay, good. Yeah. So the problem is, if you buy the Jordan Peterson argument, and it's not just him, there are some mainstream evolutionary psychologists or economists who would put forward this point of view as well, that we have these sort of true natural preferences. And if we've realized them in our modern societies where we have maximum freedom, and if we try and change that, if those damn feminists come in and start tinkering with it, we're either going to fail because we can't go against people just like, sorry, I just want to be a therapist. I'm not going to tinker with your widget. Or we will succeed and we'll make...
It sounds dirtier than we intended it to be, tinkering with people's widgets. This is a family program.
Okay. All right. So that's one.
Another honourable profession, might we say, and a very old and venerable profession, tinkering with widgets. Carry
on. Now I've lost my train of thought. Okay.
Sorry.
So if you hold that scientific point of view, then yes, there isn't a problem. If you think actually it's not that gender has gone away since the bad old days when we had women's jobs and men's jobs, it's just kind of evolved into a different form where gender is still very much part of our identities and our self-concepts. I mean, one kind of I'm sort of almost obsessed with gender at the moment. It's become, a really core part of people's sense of self, or at least in some groups. You could say, look, we have these influences, and we know from the fact that the differences in how men and women think, feel, and behave, and the kinds of roles that they do are so diverse, and they are so variable across time and place, that we know these things influence people's preferences. Then there's kind of a problem when those preferences are creating a society in which, yes, there's one group who are, in charge, enjoying the majority of the positions of status and authority, have more power over resources, and the other group are, to come back to the conversation we're having before, being economically vulnerable because they're doing the unpaid labor and, not socially marginalized as well. So, and of course, men are also missing out. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, there are lots of joys from that time with family, and men are missing out on it. I mean, I actually had a colleague who described time at home with small children. He had a wonderful way. He said it's like an opera. It's like lots of boring recitative and then the occasional aria. So like, I think we can be a bit too sort of misty-eyed about, a lot of, I presume that a lot of, taking care of small children, it's hard work. And
I hated it. I hated the first few years. It was grueling. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love I'm minus 7 now, so they're fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Little people now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can say, look, and actually we can say, look, we've created a situation. We have these sort of background influences that are acting on us as individuals. They're in our interactions. They're embedded in our institutions in the way that we code jobs in a sort of gendered way that are contributing to these patterns. And we can set aside the question of to what extent they're biologically influenced, which I've spent a lot of time looking at. I'm a bit skeptical of the sort of Jordan Peterson arguments. And we can think about can we get gender equality through these arrangements? And I'm thinking of gender equality in a very broad way, not just about, gender pay gap and seats on boards, but in this broad sense of well-being. Do you have access to be able to care for your family? Are you able to engage in paid work and meaningful products? Are you able to get educated and use that education in that work? Are you physically safe? Are you mentally safe? Do you get respect and so on, right? And you can, my argument is, some ways women are doing better than men, in some ways men are doing than women overall. But part of the ways in which people are not able to access well-being, which is massively impacted by the work that we do, is because we still are kind of stuck in this sort of modified version of the breadwinner homemaker situation. And we do have industries and occupations and leadership positions that are male dominated, and that's sort of undermining of well-being for everyone. It's not just about women, but it is also a situation in which women do end up with less status, less power.
I want to come back to the home and the gender roles in the home because that interests me. But just because you just mentioned the dearth of women in leadership positions, I just want to address that. So if you were going to transition from a world in which women were disempowered to one in which they had equal opportunities, there would be a period during which the old judges and CEOs and world leaders would still be male. So it does strike a lot of people as disingenuous. I think a lot of guys as disingenuous when they hear statistics about how few Supreme Court justices and like senior senators and greatest and people in professions which took 40 years for them to get there are male. When you look at the fact that the majority of college graduates are female and girls are doing so much better at school and boys drop out of high school at 40% higher rates than females do, and females dominate in a number of very lucrative professions of the future in terms of their graduation rates. And so in terms, if you look at veterinarians or pharmacists or, public relations people, there are all kinds of industries which are massively female dominated. When I was at the ABC, my senior producer was a woman, my junior producer was a woman, my boss was a woman, her boss was a man, but his boss was a woman, the chairman of the company was a woman. You would expect there to be a period of transition time. So it can sound a bit, when we talk about like the lack of women in C-suites, it can sound a little bit like, if Mormons had always been banned from, playing pickleball, and all of a sudden you let them in to play pickleball, you would expect there to be a period of time when the best pickleball players of all time and like the Hall of Famers still lacked Mormons. But if you tried to make the Hall of Famers equal, then that would mean basically no one who wasn't a Mormon would ever get anything for the duration of the transition period. Does that make sense?
You're saying we just have to be patient and these things.
Well, yeah, being patient sounds a little bit glib. Looking at the input to the pipeline, and if that is egalitarian, then the rest will absolutely sort itself out. Otherwise, you would just have to never promote a male in any. And this is happening. I mean, I have male friends who are in middle to senior management who, because of the equity and inclusion and diversity policies of their big multinational corporations have absolutely no prospect of promotion because there's no way that they can get to the 30% female senior management that they've put as a target by 2030 if any male at all gets promoted.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think targets and quotas are a difficult philosophical position. You know, I feel I have become sort of increasingly ambivalent about those things. I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into whether you engage in those really strong forms of affirmative action.
I mean, just to clarify, I wouldn't say that that we're necessarily talking about the same thing. So a target or a quota, I think, could be totally justified if you're talking about the input phase of an industry. Like I think there might be two questions, right? One might be, would it be legitimate to require a company to have a 30%, a minimum 30 or 40 or 50% female intake into its internship, into its junior internship program? That might be a question about diversity and quotas. And you might have one answer about that, but you might have a different answer about whether or not senior management or the justices on a court, or CEOs or prime ministers or senators should be equal, because it takes 30 years to get enough, to get the qualifications to do those positions. So I think the quota question is distinct from whether or not we regard it as being a burning issue of gender justice that women are underrepresented as judges.
Yeah, look.
Like, as long as women are overrepresented as lawyers, they're going to end up being overrepresented as judges.
Well, I'm not 100% sure that that's true. I mean, what you tend to see is that even in sort of industries where it's female dominated at the entry level, you still see this tapering off as you get to the top.
How do you think that happens? What's our explanation for that, if that were going to continue? Yeah. G'day, humans. Well, if you've listened to this much of the episode, then you must enjoy it, presumably, unless you're just listening for masochistic reasons. So you should listen to the rest of it. And the way you do that is by subscribing to the premium feed, where you not only get to hear the rest of this delightful conversation, and trust me, it gets better than what you just heard, but you also get to hear no ads, 0 ads. And previously, up until now, you had to go to the old Substack to do that and follow me on Substack and add one more platform to your life if you're not already on Substack. But here's the thing. We are now on Apple Premium Podcast as well. So with one click, Apple will just subscribe you up to the premium feed. You'll be able to listen to the rest of this conversation right now. So open up your Apple Podcasts, click the old Pay Old Zepsy button. That's probably what it's called, Pay Old Zepsy. And you click the button, and then you no longer have to be a free rider. You can feel like you're contributing to the mission of this show, which is really what we're all here for: better conversations, a freer, more freewheeling attitude towards the things that we can talk about, a way to steel man our opponents and to take the most gracious approach towards disagreement. That is what you're voting for when you vote for Uncomfortable Conversations by going into your Apple Podcasts and clicking subscribe. I love you. If you don't do that, that's fine. I'll see you the next free episode, I guess. Take care.